Hi everyone. These are the lecture notes for Unit 3, Chapter 2. I will be posting separate lecture notes for Chapter 3 in this unit. So in these notes I'm going to summarize the main ideas from Chapter 2 and 3 in Sias's book, and specifically we're going to review the LMX theory, leader-member exchange theory. Then I'm going to move into a discussion about framing the concepts in Chapter 2 within the 4 theoretical perspectives that Dr. Sias uses throughout her book. And those would be post-positivism, social construction, critical theory, and structuration theory. So why is it important for us to understand these theoretical perspectives, you ask? Because we are communication scholars. Yes, we are communication scholars, and we study communication within these lenses that Sias lays out in her book. We all view the world in different ways. So that's why I wanted to talk more about the theoretical lenses, because I want you to think about which one speaks to you the most on how to view the relationships we're going to examine over the course of the semester. And specifically in Chapter 2, we're looking at supervisor-subordinate relationship. So Sias asks us at the beginning of Chapter 2, what is at the heart of most organizations and work relationships? Hierarchy. We all experience it at work or in organizations or clubs that we belong to. And hierarchy is just simply a chain of commands that we all have to follow. And of course, this is also reflected in supervisor-subordinate relationships. So supervisor-subordinate relationships, according to Sias, are workplace relationships in which one partner, the supervisor, holds direct formal authority over the other, or the subordinate. You will find a large amount of research on this topic if you do a cursory search in Google Scholar. So supervisor-subordinate communication, conflict, relationships, exchange, role, similarity, and that's just scratching the surface, but there's been a lot of research done on supervisor-subordinate relationships over the decades. Think back to your intro to organizational communication class and the theories of management that were discussed, such as Taylorism, human relations, human resources, the trait theory of management, Blake and Mouton's managerial grid, Hershey and Blanchard's situational leadership theory, just to name a few. All of these theories led up to examining the impact of leaders on the people that they manage. This leads us to LMX theory, or again, leader-member exchange theory. Green and his colleagues begin with the assumption that organizational members accomplish their work through roles, and employees develop those roles through interactions with other employees. The supervisor-subordinate relationship is critical to role development. And role development comes in 3 phases, as we'll see in the next 2 slides. We have role taking, role making, role routinization. So let's first look at role taking. When a new employee comes on board and meets their new boss, the new boss attempts to discover the talents that the new employee has and what motivates them. So usually how this occurs is that the boss makes different requests and watches to see how it works out. So for example, your supervisor wants to see how organized you are, so you're given a project to update a client list. And your supervisor might observe how you go about this, how you get organized. So in the role-taking phase, there's a lot of uncertainty going on, and there's an attempt to gain familiarity between the supervisor and the subordinate. You can also think of this phase as the subordinate employee takes what the supervisor gives. The second phase of role development in LMX theory is role making. So in this, a little bit of uncertainty has been reduced between the new subordinate and the supervisor, and they're moving away from the one-way exchange of the supervisor gives and the subordinate takes. And the subordinate begins to take on more work as his or her own and tailors it based on the talents that that person possesses and the demands of other job responsibilities. So there's a balance the new employee is attempting to balance. This is a negotiation phase between the supervisor and subordinate, and more resources are exchanged. So by resources, I mean the employee may offer more time, more refined skills, more effort, and the supervisor may offer tangible rewards and increased attention and support toward the subordinate. So again, a lot of uncertainty has been reduced, and there's more forming of a professional and yet intimate relationship. The role routinization phase is the third phase of role development process, and it represents the points at which the behaviors of the supervisor and subordinate are well understood. So the two people understand each other now. The supervisor has, although the supervisor and subordinate have a unique relationship, the supervisor has unique relationships with each individual subordinate. And the development process is unique as well. So if you think about that supervisor as a central point, and then the subordinates in the outlying areas, you get the idea of maybe a wheel with spokes on it. And all these relationships are unique. In this phase, there may be in-group relationships and out-group relationships. So in the in-group, you have favored subordinates who are assigned more interesting tasks, given greater responsibility and authority. High levels of trust exist. Mutual influence exists. In the out-group, subordinates are simply expected to comply with formal rules and do what is required of them. As a result, they receive the standard benefits of the job, because with an out-group relationship, there are low levels of trust and low levels of support from supervisor to subordinate. If you've ever been in an in-group or an out-group, you know how it feels. So it's very different. When you're in the out-group, it's like you're on the outside looking in. Remember that all of these role phases are embedded within an organizational context. LMX has formed the foundation of most research about supervisor-subordinate relationships since the 1980s. So it's been a well-examined theory that has withstood the test of time. And of course, there have been different developments and additions to it, but it's a very solid theory. Now let's look at supervisor-subordinate relationships through the four theoretical lenses that I mentioned earlier. Keep in mind that Table 2.1 in the Sias text, she outlines the functions of supervisor-subordinate relationships, developments, and outcomes. These areas are the focus when using the different theoretical perspectives. So as I go through these perspectives, think in terms of supervisor-subordinate relationships. Post-positivism is the first one. Let me just mention too that I posted videos for each theory that will help you gain a better understanding of the principles of each theory. And they're more in-depth videos, so be sure and watch those if you haven't. So with a post-positivism lens, those who view supervisor-subordinate relationships see this relationship as one in which human beings are observable physical objects who occupy a physical space. If you hear some detachment on the part of the researcher in this perspective, you're correct. This is more of an empirical, scientific, rational view of humans. Researchers who favor this perspective use surveys to measure attitudes, values, and perceptions. And the data is collected through self-report methods. So, for example, when you fill out a survey or a questionnaire, that's self-report. The research in social science, especially communication, relies heavily on self-report data in observation. In examining physical attributes of individuals, researchers also examine gender orientation, physical sex, age, race, etc., in the context that they are functioning in. Relationships exist in a container, which is the organizational context for our purposes. Post-positivism research gives us a snapshot inside of a relationship in a specific time and place. In other words, the relationship exists within a container. Using this perspective, we would see the functions of supervisor-subordinate relationships, leadership, information exchange, feedback and appraisal, mentoring, and power is happening within a specific context that's not movable or changeable. The social construction perspective is next, and it's very different. It's on the opposite end of the spectrum from post-positivism. Reality is socially constructed and is not static, but is dynamic. It's changeable. Organizations are socially constructed and influenced by humans, by their communication and their behavior. And for this reason, organizations experience instability and change as influenced by inside and outside forces. So, supervisor-subordinate relationships exist through communication or in your communication with your supervisor. Context doesn't factor in as much in this perspective as much as the relationship and communication does. So as communication changes, deeper trust may develop or not, and the relationship can change in either positive or negative ways. Researchers using this paradigm or this theoretical perspective ask questions using how, what, and why. These are more open-ended explorations and allow researchers to explore more possibilities beyond the main research question. So, for example, how do leaders mentor long-term employees? And data in this perspective is usually, it can be self-report, but it's usually collected through interviewing. All right, let's look at critical theory. Critical theory always examines issues of power, dominance, and control. And because it relies on social construction, in that power, dominance, and control are controlled through communication, or constructed through communication, it shares many similarities with social construction. And this theory addresses the themes of reification, consent, universalization of managerial interest, and the dominance of technical reasoning, according to Dietz. Stanley Dietz is a sociology researcher, and he is very influential in critical theory. So reification attempts to take, when you reify something, that means you're taking an abstract concept and trying to make them more tangible or concrete. For example, we talk about good managers, good, quote, managers. We all have different ideas about what makes a good manager, and so that varies from person to person. But we look for a physical manifestation of good. So perhaps a good manager smiles a lot. Perhaps a good manager is kind and exhibits kindness to employees. So reifying something just takes the abstract and attempts to move it into the concrete. Consent and managerial reasoning are grounded in concepts of power of the supervisor over the subordinate. And technical reasoning occurs when rational reasoning is given privilege over emotional reasoning. And if you think about the workplace, people are very uncomfortable with emotion in the workplace. So rational or technical reasoning in this theory is the dominant way of making sense. All right, the last theory is structuration theory, and again, it's very similar to social construction, and it conceptualizes society and organizations as being formed in human behavior and interaction. In this theory, workplaces are seen as systems. So if you think about systems theory or Carl Weick's theory of organizing, you can see where structuration comes into play. Systems theory has so many different aspects to it, but there are rules or there's a flow about how things work. And when you think about structuration theory, you think about a set way of the way things work. In this theory, relationships between supervisors and subordinates are seen as contained within an organization. They're not transferable outside of the organization because they are structured by the rules of the organization. So look back over chapter 2 and let's see, what is the page number? Look at page 21 and the relationship functions and think about them in terms of these 4 perspectives and think about them in terms of LMX theory, because those are the main ideas with which to frame these functions within this chapter. All right, that is the end of my notes for chapter 2. Chapter 3 will be coming up very shortly.